The stories the elders tell about Morrys' birth carry the weight of omens. They whisper them on winter nights when snow falls thick enough to muffle sound. The midwife's hands came away empty of sight. The newborn's eyes were there, perfectly formed, but the mechanisms that should have created vision simply didn't function. Her mother wept not from grief but from the recognition that her daughter had entered a world that would see her deficiency before it saw her. Wolves are predators. In their hierarchy, blindness isn't merely a disability. It's an invitation, an opening in the armor, a signal that the natural order permits her removal. Born in the same season was another infant, a male child whose parents were minor nobility in the pack. His name was Theron. Unlike Morrys, he entered the world with every advantage. Perfect vision, strong limbs, the bearing of someone destined for dominance. As the two cubs grew, their trajectories diverged completely. Theron flourished in every measurable way. He learned to hunt before other cubs his age. He won every sparring match. He moved through the pack's hierarchy with the ease of someone born to power. Morrys, meanwhile, developed something that looked like weakness to everyone around her. Blindness, uncertainty, the constant need to adapt to a world that hadn't been designed for her perception. What no one understood, not yet, was that Morrys' blindness was forging something extraordinary. While other blind creatures struggle with sound and scent alone, Morrys developed awareness that operated on entirely different frequencies. She learned to navigate the world through vibrations in the earth beneath her paws. She understood the electromagnetic signatures of other wolves before they entered her immediate vicinity. She developed such exquisite sensitivity to air pressure changes that she could map entire chambers of the den before ever physically entering them. By adolescence, when both Morrys and Theron reached mating age, it became clear what the fates had written. They were destined mates. Not through choice, not through preference, but through the cosmic laws that govern their kind. The bond was written in the moment of their simultaneous birth. It existed in the space between starlight and shadow, and Theron, who just secured his position as alpha of their generation through combat dominance over other males his age, would have to acknowledge it. Everyone expected him to refuse. No one was surprised when he did. Full moon. The entire pack gathered in the stone clearing where such declarations had occurred for generations. Theron stood before the assembled wolves, his bearing radiating the absolute certainty of someone who just defeated every other male of his generation to claim dominance. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that came with being apex predator, the unmistakable resonance of someone who'd spent his entire adolescence proving his superiority. "I reject this connection," he announced, each word falling like a stone. "This blind female cannot stand beside an alpha. She represents everything I've built my strength in opposition to. She is liability. She is the opposite of everything required to lead." The pack listened in the charged silence that follows transgression. Rejecting a fated mate was dangerous. It meant spitting directly into the face of forces that most wolves believed governed existence itself. But Theron possessed the confidence of someone whose dominance was freshly proven. He'd just defeated rivals. He'd just claimed the alpha position. He believed his power made him untouchable. Morrys stood in the clearing's center, unable to perceive the faces watching her, but acutely aware of the emotional radiation flooding outward from them. She felt Theron's presence withdraw from the bond that had always hummed in the background of her consciousness. A connection she'd never wanted, but had accepted as inevitability. When it severed, the sensation was equivalent to having a limb torn away. Not painfully, but with absolute finality. A part of her existence simply ceased. "She will be taken to the sacred caves," Theron continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd just claimed. The mountains will become her only territory. No pack member will visit. No resources will be provided. She will live out her existence in isolation, removed from all civilized structure. What Theron didn't know, what he'd made certain no one could know, was that he'd spent the previous months systematically destroying every historical record related to those caves. He'd burned scrolls describing the cycles. He'd erased documentation about what occurred there every 1,000 years, because knowledge of divine intervention would undermine his newly won authority. Morrys was brought to the caves at dawn, not ceremoniously, not with supplies adequate for survival, just deposited at the mouth of a cavern system and left to either adapt or die. The pack expected the latter. Starvation seemed probable. Exposure to mountain winters seemed inevitable. Hypothermia, predation from creatures that might hunt in the darkness. Every possibility pointed toward a quiet end. Instead, Morrys began the work of becoming something unprecedented. The caves weren't hostile to her blindness. They were neutral, and in that neutrality she flourished. Her heightened sensory capability allowed her to navigate the cavern systems with absolute precision. She learned which passages held fresh water, which chambers maintained bearable temperatures, which tunnels connected to hunting grounds where prey animals gathered. She began to understand that her lack of sight was actually an advantage in darkness. Light was irrelevant to her. Shadows were fiction. She moved through the caves with the confidence of someone who'd never known any other way to exist. Years passed. 5 of them. Morrys developed strength that had nothing to do with pack hierarchy and everything to do with pure necessity. Her muscles became efficient. Her senses became so calibrated that she could detect a single heartbeat from 100 paces away. She could smell emotions in the air with such precision that she understood another creature's intent before they'd even fully committed to action. And then, on a night when the wind carried unfamiliar scents down from the mountain's upper regions, she detected something that made her ancient awareness pause. Movement, deliberate approach, someone climbing toward her deliberately through darkness. Her first response was defensive, the pack coming to ensure her extinction. But the signature she detected was different, smaller, familiar in a way that resonated with her deepest consciousness. Not a threat, a presence that carried intention without malice. She shifted into human form and waited. The wolf that emerged from the darkness was smaller than Morrys had expected. When he shifted to human form, she immediately understood who he was. Not through sight, she couldn't see his face, but through the specific emotional signature he carried. She knew his heartbeat pattern, knew the exact chemical composition of his fear mixed with determination. This was a wolf from the pack, someone who'd made the deliberate choice to climb the mountain in secret. Someone who was risking serious consequence for this visit. Corvus approached carefully, understanding that this blind female could perceive him far better than he could perceive her in the darkness. "I'm Theron's brother," he said quietly, his voice carrying apology in its very tone. "My name is Corvus. I came because what he did was wrong. And I needed you to know that not everyone in the pack agrees with his rejection. Not everyone sees you the way he does." Morrys listened to him with senses that went far deeper than hearing. She perceived the exact nature of his guilt, the specific way his body trembled with the risk he was taking, the genuine compassion radiating from him like heat. "Why would you risk coming here?" she asked. Corvus took a breath, gathering courage for what he was about to offer. "Because he's my brother and I love him, but he's wrong about you," he replied. And because you deserve to know that blindness isn't weakness. It's just difference. And the pack is too small to understand the value of difference. He paused, his expression showing the internal struggle between family loyalty and moral conviction. I'm going to keep coming. I'm going to bring you supplies, food, things to make your exile bearable. Because that's the only way I know to tell Theron that his rejection was a mistake. Morrys perceived the absolute truth of his words. This male, Theron's own brother, was choosing compassion over family hierarchy. What neither Morrys nor Corvus understood was that they were standing in the presence of cosmic significance. The sacred caves weren't merely ancient refuges. They existed at a convergence point. Once every 1,000 years, Lunara, the entity that had written the laws governing fated mates, that controlled the fundamental forces binding pack society together, would visit this specific location. The knowledge had been documented in the oldest records, carved into stone by ancient wolves, written in languages that predated even the pack's oldest family lines. And Theron had spent months burning every reference to it. He'd destroyed scrolls. He'd erased stone carvings. He'd issued edicts forbidding anyone from speaking about the cycles. Because if the pack knew that divine intervention was possible, that the goddess could grant gifts independent of alpha authority, it would fundamentally undermine his control. In his arrogance, in his desperate need to eliminate any force that might supersede his dominion, Theron had created the exact circumstances that would render him obsolete. Corvus had always questioned whether cruelty and necessity were truly synonymous. While others celebrated Theron's dominance and Morrys' banishment as proof of natural hierarchy, Corvus had questioned the entire structure. Watching the female his brother had rejected be cast out with no resources, no compassion, no acknowledgement of her worth, something in Corvus had fractured. He began making regular visits to the caves, bringing supplies she didn't need but accepting because the gesture itself, the acknowledgement of her existence, became more valuable than survival resources. What began as familial obligation to oppose his brother's cruelty transformed into something far more complicated. Something the pack explicitly forbade. His wolf nature screamed at him to claim her publicly, to establish a bond before the entire pack. To prove that she had value. To prove that Theron's rejection was the error of an arrogant male who couldn't see what was right in front of him. The urge was becoming physical, a constant tension in his chest and limbs. Every time he visited the caves, he told himself it would be the last time. Every time he left her, he felt something inside him break. And every time he returned, he discovered the break had never actually healed. It had just developed calluses. He began having moments where he couldn't remember why he was restraining himself. The law said that claiming a female rejected by another alpha was a challenge to that alpha's dominion. The law said that such a bond was rebellion. But the law had also said Morrys was worthless, and the law had been proven catastrophically wrong. If the law could be wrong about her, what else was it wrong about? Corvus's internal conflict intensified. His love for her became undeniable. His need to claim her publicly became overwhelming. And his understanding that doing so would mean war with his own brother became absolute. 1,000 years had passed since the last visitation, and the cycle was beginning again. Morrys felt it as a shift in the atmospheric pressure itself. Not a sound. Not a smell. Something deeper. A shift in the fundamental nature of reality itself. The caves began emitting something she'd never encountered, a resonance that her heightened awareness could perceive but not quantify. It was similar to how she understood a heartbeat or an emotional state, but operating on a magnitude that made those seem trivial. Light manifested inside the caverns. Not from any source. Just present. luminescence that existed independent of fire or sun. And Morrys, who'd lived her entire existence without seeing, somehow understood this light through the same sensory apparatus that allowed her to navigate in complete darkness. She transformed into her wolf form instinctively, and then the entity appeared, not as human, not as wolf, as something that existed across multiple forms simultaneously. Presence incarnate, power that seemed to bend reality itself around her. Lunara, the architect of bonds, the force that shaped existence. She addressed Morrys not through sound but through direct transfer of understanding, concepts flowing directly into consciousness without requiring translation. You were delivered to this place by cruelty, Lunara communicated. The Alpha who rejected you destroyed the records that would have shown him what he was doing. His desperation to maintain control made him unknowingly architect your arrival at exactly this moment. Morrys's wolf form trembled, not from fear but from the magnitude of what was occurring. You came into the world without sight, Lunara continued. Your kind interpreted this as diminishment, but I see differently. I perceive a consciousness that has developed capabilities that sighted creatures cannot achieve. I see potential that was forged not through dominance, but through the necessity of survival. The entity moved closer, and reality itself seemed to reorganize around her presence. I will not grant you sight, she said. Your blindness is not a deficit requiring correction. It is the foundation of everything you will become. But I will amplify what you've already cultivated. I will open sensory channels that your species doesn't normally access. You will perceive the world in ways that will make you unprecedented. Not through divine intervention, but through the natural extension of your own capabilities. Lunara's presence enveloped her, and for a moment, Morrys understood existence on a level that transcended language. She felt the goddess's ancient knowledge, her endless cycles, her impartial observation of the world she'd helped create. And then the presence withdrew, leaving Morrys alone in the caves with something new flowing through her consciousness. The transformation hadn't happened, but it was beginning. The transformation didn't happen suddenly. It was gradual. Over weeks, Morrys's already heightened senses began evolving into something that transcended normal categories. She could detect electromagnetic fields with such precision that she understood the location and emotional state of every living creature within miles of her position. She could sense heartbeats from distances that should have been impossible. She could perceive vibrations in the earth caused by footsteps from locations she'd never physically visited. She learned to identify emotions by the specific molecular changes they created in the air. Fear smelled different from desire. Anger had a different signature than grief. She could read another creature's entire psychological state before they'd made any conscious decision about their actions. Her awareness expanded like a ripple through water, touching every living thing in the surrounding territories. When Corvus next visited her, he found her transformed in ways that went beyond the physical. She sensed his approach from the mountain's highest point. When he attempted to move silently, she heard the specific rhythm his heart was maintaining. When he tried to hide his emotions, she felt them radiating from him like actual heat. "What's happened to you?" he asked, and his voice carried something between terror and recognition. Morrys shifted into human form for the first time in weeks. Her body was different. Not visibly, but the way she inhabited it had changed. Where once there'd been uncertainty in her movements, now there was absolute precision. She understood her location not through memory of stone and passage, but through constant sensory feedback. She perceived Corvus's exact position, his exact emotional state, his specific physiological response to her proximity. She moved toward him, her blind eyes somehow perceiving everything about his internal state. She took his face in her hands and felt the specific temperature shift of his blood rushing beneath his skin, the acceleration of his heartbeat, the exact nature of his emotional response. And in that moment, with her hands on his face, she understood completely what he felt for her. It was written in the heat signature of his skin, the specific molecules his body was releasing, the electrical pattern of his neural response to her proximity. He loved her, completely, desperately, against every law that forbade it, against his own brother's decree. "You know," she said softly, "you understand what I've become." "Yes," Corvus whispered, "and I love you more because of it. Not less, more." In that moment, in the darkness of the caves, two souls acknowledged what had been growing between them. It was dangerous. It was forbidden. It was inevitable. The invasion came from an alpha named Vexter, who'd spent 20 years building something Theron had only inherited. A coalition of wolves who followed him not from supernatural compulsion, but from genuine belief in his vision. Vexter didn't conquer territories. He liberated them from what he called the tyranny of single alpha rule. His forces moved with military precision because they'd been trained by someone who understood strategy like a human general understands war. And they'd identified Theron's territory not as weakness to exploit, but as an ideological threat. Because if Theron's pack fell, it would prove that traditional hierarchy was vulnerable. In his command tent 3 days before the assault, Vexter reviewed intelligence reports with his second-in-command, a scarred female named Kale. "Their defenses are adequate but uninspired," she said. 3 days of concentrated assault should break their resistance. But Vexter was thinking beyond the immediate conflict. He'd heard rumors about what was happening in Theron's territory. Stories about governance councils, about authority being distributed rather than concentrated, about pack members having voice in decisions. It was chaos masquerading as progress. It was exactly the kind of ideological weakness that threatened everything he'd built. If he didn't act now, other territories would begin questioning whether single alpha rule was even necessary. "Push the timeline," he told Kale. "I want forces mobilized by tomorrow. The sooner we eliminate this threat, the sooner other alphas can return to understanding what order actually requires." The scouts reported what everyone feared. Vexter's coalition vastly outnumbered Theron's available warriors. They possessed weapons crafted from paranormal materials. They had multiple commanders functioning with military discipline. In conventional conflict, Theron's territory would fall within weeks. The pack began preparing for what they believed would be their final stand. Warriors positioned themselves at strategic locations. Families contemplated evacuation. Elders discussed the mechanics of surrender. The entire territory smelled of desperation and impending loss. But in the caves on the sacred mountain, Morrys felt the shift. Her extended awareness detected the movement of Vexter's forces. She perceived the terror radiating from the pack below. She understood with absolute certainty what was being asked of her, not through words, but through the fundamental resonance of crisis itself. Corvus brought her news during one of his visits, and when he saw her expression shift, he understood what she'd already decided. She was descending from the caves. She was ending her exile voluntarily. She was going to save the territory that had attempted to erase her. "You can't do this," Corvus said immediately. "If you reveal yourself, everything changes. Your safety ends. Your isolation ends." Morrys moved through the cavern system with her perfect sensory awareness. She placed her hand on Corvus's face, feeling his features the way she always did, reading his emotional state through subtle temperature shifts and the specific rhythm of his heartbeat. "I was always going to descend," she said quietly. "I've been growing stronger every moment. Eventually, I would have walked down from this mountain by choice. The invasion simply accelerates timing." She traced the line of his jaw. "Besides, if I don't intervene, they die. The pack, the territory, everyone. And I won't carry that weight. I won't permit their destruction when I possess the capacity to prevent it." Corvus captured her hand, pressed it against his chest where his heart was beating in rapid patterns. "If you do this, there's no returning to what we had. They'll expect service, obedience. They'll attempt to control you." "Let them attempt," Morrys said, and something in her voice made it clear this was no longer a conversation that could change the outcome. She transformed into her wolf form, and the size of her was different. The power radiating from her was enough to make even Corvus's alpha instincts recognize deference. She was no longer the survivor learning to exist. She was the warrior awakening. She was the force that would remake the world. And she turned toward the mountain's edge, ready to descend into territories that had forgotten she existed. Corvus watched her go, understanding that when she returned, if she returned, she would be something beyond his comprehension. And he would follow her anyway, because that was the only choice that mattered. Love, not compulsion, not supernatural bonds. Just the simple, revolutionary choice of one being deciding that another being was worth everything. Morrys descended the mountain like an avalanche in flesh form. Her presence announced itself through physical reality itself. Warriors from Vexter's forces felt her approach before registering her visually. The ground trembled with her movement. The air pressure shifted. And when she emerged from the mountain passes, moving into the territory where Theron's pack was preparing defensive positions, every conflict paused. Both armies, warriors froze mid-movement. Commanders turned their entire focus toward the new presence. The entire battlefield held its breath. What they perceived was something that transcended traditional categories of threat. A wolf of such magnitude that size became almost irrelevant. A being that radiated power so intensely that even the most aggressive warriors instinctively recognized they were facing something beyond their capacity to oppose. Theron's expression transformed from hope to shock to the specific realization that comes with understanding one's own catastrophic error. He recognized her immediately, the blind Omega, the one he'd rejected. The one he'd believed was either dead or permanently contained in mountain isolation. She'd become something beyond his comprehension. Vexter assessed her with military calculation, and for the first time in years, his expression showed genuine uncertainty. He'd prepared for conventional warfare, for numerical superiority overcoming technical skill. But this was something different. This was a force that existed outside military strategy. This was something that couldn't be conquered through organization or overwhelming numbers. Morrys transformed into human form, her blind eyes unseeing but radiating absolute awareness. When she spoke, her voice carried resonance that suggested she was speaking directly into the consciousness of every wolf present. "I am Morrys," she announced. "I was born incomplete. I was rejected by my fated mate. I was exiled to the mountains to perish. But I did not perish. Instead, I became something unprecedented. Something that transcends the categories your society uses to measure strength. And this territory will not fall. Not because I serve any alpha. Not because I accept your hierarchy. But because I've chosen to save what is mine." The weight of her words settled over the battlefield like a physical force. She was claiming the territory not as a subject, but as a sovereign. She was declaring independence not just from Vexter's invasion, but from the entire system that had created her exile. And in that moment, everything changed. Morrys descended on Vexter's forward position like an avalanche gaining consciousness. Warriors had time to register her presence, that moment of realization when they understood what they were facing, and then she was through them. A wolf to her left attempted flanking attack. She sensed him before his paws left the ground and pivoted, her mass and speed combining into something that left him gasping for breath on the mountain stone. 3 warriors struck simultaneously from different angles. Morrys perceived each attack with perfect clarity and moved not away from them but through them, using their momentum against their own bodies. She didn't pause, didn't savor victory, simply moved to the next cluster of warriors, the next threat, the next coordinated strike that dissolved the moment she understood it. Vexter's voice cut through the chaos, a command to regroup. It was smart tactical thinking. It didn't matter, because Morrys could hear every word he spoke and predict exactly where his strategic mind would direct his remaining forces. She reached him in the center of the field, both of them transforming to wolf form. Him because it was his final hope, her because his form represented something concentrated she could address directly. Their collision was the meeting of 2 absolute forces. Vexter was massive, every muscle honed through decades of alpha training. Morrys was faster, and more importantly, she perceived the world in ways his consciousness couldn't access. She knew where he would strike before his muscles committed to the motion. She anticipated his defensive postures before he'd decided to adopt them. When she had him pinned, his chest heaving, his strength finally exhausted, she made a choice. She didn't end him. Instead, she held him there, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to pretend he'd ever been on equal footing with what she'd become. In the days following the conflict, Morrys demanded an encounter with Theron. They faced each other in the Great Hall, surrounded by witnesses, surrounded by the entire pack's attention. Theron attempted to maintain his bearing as an alpha, but both of them understood that power had fundamentally shifted. Morrys looked at him with eyes that couldn't see but somehow perceived everything. "You rejected me," she said, her voice steady, her power carefully contained. "You declared me deficient. You banished me to the mountains intending my death. You did these things believing it demonstrated your dominance." She paused, and the entire hall absorbed her words. "But your rejection delivered me directly to the location where the entity visits. Your desperate need to control narrative by destroying records meant you had no knowledge of what you were doing." "I forgive you," Morrys continued, and the words carried genuine absolution. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because my existence, in its final accounting, has become something far greater than your rejection could diminish. Your fear created the exact circumstances that forged my strength. So I release you from carrying the weight of your cruelty. That's not mercy. That's irrelevance. You're no longer significant enough for me to maintain anger toward." Theron stood in the great hall and understood, with the finality of physical sensation, that his world had ended. Not dramatically, not violently, but completely. He understood every decision he'd made that led to this. The records he'd destroyed, the blind Omega he'd rejected, the exile he'd decreed. Every choice had been a catastrophic error. He watched Corvus step forward from the crowd. He watched his own brother move to claim the female he'd rejected. "Pack law identifies this bond as rebellion," Morrys announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. By claiming me, he challenges the Alpha's decree. By claiming me, he defies the hierarchy he was born into. Pack law says he should be executed for this, that his bloodline should be severed, that his name should be struck from the record. She took Corvus's hand. I reject that law entirely. I've existed outside your society since birth. I've been blind in a world that prizes sight. I've been diminished in a world that values dominance. I've been exiled in a world that enforces belonging. And I've transcended every limitation you attempted to impose on my existence. So I will not accept your laws regarding love. I will establish this bond publicly, and I will challenge any of you to oppose it. Corvus pulled her close. When they kissed, every wolf in the hall could smell the shift, the specific pheromone signature of a claim being established. They could feel the electromagnetic shift that occurred when a bond was being consciously forged rather than supernaturally imposed. Some warriors vocalized approval, the sound of change being accepted. Some elders looked away in disapproval. Theron's expression hardened with rage and the dawning realization that his own brother had not just claimed his rejected mate. He'd done it publicly, defiantly, in a way that shattered every hierarchy Theron had constructed. Corvus held her, and his entire body trembled with the realization that the woman he'd loved in secret caves was now publicly his. Not through fated bond, not through supernatural compulsion, but because he'd chosen her, because he'd stood before the entire pack and claimed her as his equal, against his own brother. In the weeks following, pack structure began reorganizing itself. Morrys established a council structure, a system where authority was distributed among multiple voices rather than concentrated in a single ruler, where Corvus functioned as her equal, not her subordinate, where elders who'd been marginalized were granted genuine influence. The goddess's influence seemed to deepen throughout the territory as other wolves began experiencing subtle changes in their own capabilities. Increased sensory awareness. Moments of connection that transcended normal bonds. It was as if Morrys' transformation had created resonance affecting everyone in proximity. Other territories began sending representatives, having heard about the blind Omega who'd defeated an invasion alone. And at the center of it all remained the simple truth. One blind Omega and one devoted male had chosen each other, in defiance of every law that forbade it, in revolution against everything they'd been told to accept. Their choice, repeated daily, proved that love, when freely chosen, is the most revolutionary force in any world.